What if the world's most iconic civilization wasn't the beginning, but the middle of the story? Along the banks of the Nile, Egypt seems to start fully formed, a united kingdom stretching from cataract to delta, monumental architecture that defies explanation, complex hieroglyphs appearing without apprenticeship, and astronomical knowledge precise enough to align massive pyramids to the cardinal directions with accuracy. There are no traces of the slow climb from primitive to sophisticated, nor attempts at building in stone, no gradual refinement of techniques over generations. It's as if this kingdom didn't invent civilization at all, but inherited it, gathering the scattered fragments of an older world and building something magnificent on foundations that were already ancient when the first pyramid rose from the desert sand. If you've ever felt like human history has missing chapters, like we're living in the sequel to a story no one remembers, then you're ready for what we found. What follows are the mysteries of a civilization that began midway through its development, carrying forward memories of something that came before. The fluorescent lights hum quietly overhead in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, casting their steady glow across display cases that have held Egypt's treasures for over a century. Most visitors pause briefly at each exhibit before moving on. But here, before a particular glass case, something makes them linger. Perhaps it's the way the carved green schist seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, or how the ancient grooves still hold shadows that flicker as people pass by. The Nema palette rests on its custom stand, both faces visible through carefully positioned mirrors. Carved from a single piece of greenish schist, it stands just over 2 feet tall, modest by Egyptian standards, yet commanding in its presence. On one face, a towering figure dominates the scene, wearing the distinctive white crown of Upper Egypt. His arm is raised, gripping a ceremonial mace, frozen forever in the moment before it strikes the kneeling captive below. Every detail speaks of absolute authority. The king's muscular frame, the enemy's helpless posture, the careful arrangement of hieroglyphs that frame the scene. Turn to view the reverse side and the same ruler appears transformed. Now he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, leading a procession of officials past rows of decapitated enemies. Their heads lie neatly arranged between their own legs, a grim testament to the price of resistance. At the center of this face, 2 mythical creatures with serpentine necks intertwine, their bodies forming a perfect circle. The symbolism is unmistakable. 2 separate realms bound together as one. This is the Nama palette dated to approximately 3100 BC and discovered at Hierakonpolis in the late 19th century. Scholars universally agree on what it represents: the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler. The moment when scattered kingdoms became the world's first nation-state. Yet this scholarly consensus conceals a puzzle that has troubled Egyptologists for generations. The unification appears in the archaeological record as a fully completed event, with no surviving evidence of the gradual process that should have preceded such a monumental achievement. James Quibble's excavation team pulled the palette from the sandy deposits of Hierakonpolis in 1898, along with ivory labels and ceremonial mace heads. The site had served as the religious capital of Upper Egypt during the final phase of the pre-dynastic period, a time when independent communities dotted the Nile Valley like islands in a cultural archipelago. Yet nothing in their extensive finds explained how such sophisticated political symbolism had emerged. The palette appeared complete in every sense, its artistic vocabulary fully developed, its political messaging perfectly refined, its symbolic grammar confident and assured. This completeness should trouble us more than it does. Civilizations typically leave breadcrumbs of their development scattered through time. We can trace the evolution of pottery styles across generations. Watch burial customs shift gradually as beliefs change. Observe architectural techniques improve through trial and error. Political unification, in particular, tends to be a messy, drawn-out affair that leaves abundant archaeological evidence in its wake. Egypt's unification, however, appears in the record like a magic trick performed by history itself. One moment we have the late Niccard of the Third Period with its fragmented autonomous communities, showing no sign of centralized state apparatus. The next moment we're presented with this finished masterpiece, a king who wears both crowns, commands both lands, and wields the complete symbolic vocabulary of divine kingship. Before Narma, the archaeological evidence paints a picture of prosperous but independent settlements stretched along the Nile. Each region maintained its own pottery traditions, burial practices, and religious customs. Excavations reveal sophisticated craftsmanship, evidence of long distance trade, and occasional fortifications that suggest competition between neighbors. What they don't reveal is the infrastructure necessary for political unification on this scale. Weapons and fortifications do appear in the archaeological record, but not on the scale one might expect from a campaign to conquer an entire river valley. There's no gradual standardization of symbols or practices, no evidence of the bureaucratic machinery needed to govern distant territories, no sign of their religious integration required to legitimize rule over diverse populations. The leap from a network of regional chiefs to a single divine monarch seems simply too great, too sudden. If Nama truly was the first to unify Egypt, then he accomplished in a single generation what took other civilizations centuries to achieve and somehow managed to do it so completely that no trace of the process survived. Some scholars have attempted to resolve this paradox by suggesting the palette functions more as propaganda than history. They argue it's a ceremonial object designed to project royal ideology rather than document actual events. Its original purpose, after all, involved the ritual grinding of cosmetics for temple offerings, not historical record-keeping. Perhaps its scenes represent eternal cosmic truths, the pharaoh's divine role as unifier of opposites rather than specific. Temporal conquests. This interpretation carries considerable scholarly weight. Ancient Egyptian art frequently operated on symbolic rather than literal levels, with scenes arranged to convey timeless principles rather than chronicle current events. The palette could be promoting the ideal of unity, a powerful vision of what kingship should achieve rather than what it had already accomplished. Yet this explanation struggles against the precision of the palette's imagery. These are not generic symbols, but highly specific details, identifiable crowns with their distinctive shapes and decorative elements, recognizable regional enemies rendered. With careful attention to their ethnic characteristics, precise hieroglyphic inscriptions that name specific places and titles. The intertwined necks of the mythical serpents that frame the central scene speak not of abstract cosmic harmony, but of particular realms being physically bound together through conquest and integration. If the palette were purely symbolic invention, we might expect to find earlier experimental versions of the same imagery, artists working toward this powerful visual vocabulary through generations of refinement. Instead, it appears in the archaeological record fully formed, suggesting the artisans were working from an established tradition rather than creating one from scratch. The contrast with other early civilizations makes Egypt's apparent leap even more striking. In Mesopotamia, political unification unfolded across centuries of well-documented history. Sumerian city-states like Ur, Uruk, and Lagash competed and cooperated through generations of recorded conflicts before eventually consolidating under rulers like Sargon of Akkad. Each phase of this process left clear archaeological traces. The growth of urban centers, the development of cuneiform writing systems, the standardization of weights and measures, the emergence of professional armies. The Indus Valley civilization shows similar patterns of gradual development. The great urban centers of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro evolved from earlier village cultures through visible stages of increasingly sophisticated city planning and administrative complexity. Archaeological layers reveal the step-by-step process by which scattered agricultural settlements became coordinated urban societies. Egypt, in contrast, seems to have arrived at complex statehood without leaving footprints of the journey. The administrative systems, symbolic vocabulary, and religious integration that made Narma's unified kingdom possible all appear to have been in place when he took power, not created by his conquest. Archaeologists working in the Nile Delta region have encountered this frustrating pattern repeatedly over the past century. Excavations consistently yield artifacts from the dynastic period, but reveal virtually nothing transitional between the scattered Narda communities and the unified Egyptian state. Sites that should contain evidence of gradual political integration instead seem deliberately cleared. Older settlements whose material culture has been systematically removed or obscured by later construction. This systematic absence raises an uncomfortable possibility that the evidence was intentionally erased, rather than accidentally lost. Ancient rulers frequently sought to legitimize their authority by controlling historical narratives, destroying monuments to predecessors whose claims might challenge their own, or rewriting official chronicles to emphasize their unique role as founders rather than inheritors. If Nama or his immediate successors had indeed inherited rather than created the systems of unified rule, they would have had compelling reasons to obscure that inheritance. A pharaoh who could claim to be the first unifier of Egypt wielded far more legitimacy than one who merely restored a pre-existing unity. The deliberated destruction of earlier evidence would not only eliminate potential rivals, but also ensure that the new dynasty's version of history became the only version that survived. Standing before the Nama palette today, watching how the museum's carefully positioned lighting catches the ancient chisel marks, one cannot escape the sense that this artifact represents not a beginning, but a restoration. The king's pose carries too much confidence. The symbolic vocabulary appears too sophisticated. The artistic execution seems too assured for a civilization's first attempt at representing unified kingship. Even the palette's discovery context hints at this possibility. Shirakampolis wasn't just another settlement. It was already an ancient religious center when Nama ruled, a place where traditions stretched back into the misty reaches of prehistory. The site's sacred character suggests it may have been chosen precisely because it connected the new dynasty to older sources of legitimacy, older claims to divine authority that predated the historical record. The possibility grows stronger with each passing year of archaeological research that we may be reading the middle chapters of Egypt's story and mistaking them for the first. Perhaps we are looking at Egypt's founding document. Or perhaps we are looking at Egypt's restoration deed, a carefully crafted claim to an authority that was being reclaimed rather than established for the first time. The palette itself cannot tell us which interpretation is correct. It can only continue to wait, as it has for over 5,000 years, for someone to remember what it truly means. In drawer number 847 at the storage room deep within the Egyptian Museum lies an ivory tag no larger than a playing card. Its surface, polished smooth by artisan hands over 5,000 years ago, bears a series of tiny, precise images. A falcon perched, regally above a rectangular enclosure, a vessel positioned beside rippling water, a seated figure wearing the unmistakable crown of divine authority. These are not decorative flourishes or random symbols scattered across ancient ivory. They are words, complete, readable, sophisticated words that represent some of the earliest surviving fragments of written language in human history. Yet what makes this small artifact so remarkable is not merely its antiquity, but the unsettling perfection of its execution. The hieroglyphs carved into this ivory surface speak with a voice that seems already fluent, already confident, as if the language had been practicing in secret for centuries before anyone thought to record it permanently. This ivory tag belongs to a collection of ceremonial objects discovered at Abydos. Labels, plaques, and inscribed artifacts dating to approximately 3,200 BC to 3,100 BC, marking Egypt's first tentative steps into recorded history. Among these earliest inscriptions are the famous Nama label and dozens of similar ivory tags that once identified grave goods, recorded royal names, or commemorated ceremonial events. Each piece represents Egypt's emergence into literacy, Yet collectively they present archaeology with one of its most perplexing puzzles. In these earliest known examples, Egyptian hieroglyphs already display the full range of capabilities that would define the writing system for the next 3 millennia. The symbols express proper names with phonetic precision, record complex titles with administrative accuracy, reference specific geographical locations, and seamlessly blend pictographic and phonetic elements in ways that demonstrate complete mastery of abstract linguistic concepts. The ivory tag from Draw 847 doesn't show us writing in its infancy. It shows us writing that has somehow skipped childhood entirely. Most human writing systems wear their evolutionary development openly like growth rings in an ancient tree. In Mesopotamia, the archaeological record reveals a clear progression spanning several centuries. Crude pictographs scratched into clay tablets gradually became more abstract and standardized. Simple accounting marks evolved into complex cuneiform capable of recording literature, law, and religious texts. Each generation of scribes left behind evidence of experimentation, refinement, and gradual expansion of the system's capabilities. The developmental pathway from primitive symbol making to sophisticated script is visible, traceable, and entirely logical. Egypt's hieroglyphic system, by contrast, appears in the archaeological record like an actor walking onto stage already in full costume, already knowing their lines. The missing evolutionary staircase, the gradual climb from simple marks to complex writing, simply isn't there. When hieroglyphs first appear in Egypt, they arrive not as tentative experiments, but as a mature, standardized, fully functional communication system. This absence has driven archaeologists to scour Egypt's pre-dynastic sites for evidence of earlier developmental stages. The Naqarta II period, roughly a century or two before the first hieroglyphic inscriptions, has yielded pottery bearing isolated symbols, boats, animals, geometric shapes that some scholars have suggested might represent proto-hieroglyphic writing. Yet these scattered marks remain frustratingly disconnected from the sophisticated system that would follow. They show no clear progression of increasing complexity, no growing standardization of forms, no expanding vocabulary of recognized signs. The pottery marks are too sparse, too inconsistent, and too ambiguous to represent a coherent writing system. More importantly, they failed to bridge the enormous conceptual gap between simple pictorial representation and the complex blend of logographic, syllabic, and alphabetic elements that characterizes mature hieroglyphic writing. It's as if archaeologists have found a few scattered musical notes and been asked to reconstruct a symphony. Scholars have proposed various explanations for this mysterious gap. Some have looked beyond Egypt's borders for answers, noting that the Uruk culture of Mesopotamia had already developed proto-cuneiform writing slightly earlier than Egypt's first hieroglyphs. The concept of recording language in permanent visual form might have traveled along trade routes carried by merchants, diplomats, or craftsmen who moved between the early urban centers of the ancient Middle East. This cross-cultural influence theory carries considerable scholarly weight. Archaeological evidence confirms extensive trade networks connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia during the late pre-dynastic period. Sumerian cylinder seals, Mesopotamian artistic motifs, and foreign technological innovations all appear in Egyptian archaeological contexts during precisely the period when hieroglyphic writing emerges. The timing suggests that Egypt may have borrowed the fundamental concept of writing from its neighbors. Yet this explanation, while plausible, struggles against the evidence of the writing systems themselves. Egyptian hieroglyphs are not a copy or adaptation of Mesopotamian uniform. They are visually, structurally, and conceptually distinct. Where uniform evolved toward increasingly abstract wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, hieroglyphs retained their pictorial character throughout their long history. They developed a sophisticated blend of pictographic, ideographic, and phonetic elements that operated according to entirely different principles. If Egypt had simply borrowed writing from Mesopotamia, we might expect to see more obvious similarities in structure, form, or function. Instead, Egyptian hieroglyphs appear to represent an independent solution to the problem of recording language, one that happened to emerge at roughly the same time, but followed completely different developmental logic. Other scholars have suggested a more prosaic explanation for the missing evolutionary evidence. The materials used for early writing may have been too perishable to survive in the archaeological record. Papyrus, leather, wood, and other organic materials would have decomposed entirely in most environmental conditions, leaving no trace for modern archaeologists to discover. If the earliest stages of hieroglyphic development occurred on such perishable materials, the entire experimental phase might have vanished into the soil of the Nile Valley. This organic materials hypothesis gained support from later Egyptian writing practices. Throughout most of Egypt's history, the majority of writing occurred on papyrus rather than stone. Only the most important texts, religious inscriptions, royal declarations, monumental records were carved into permanent materials. It's entirely possible that early Egyptian scribes experimented with their developing writing system on papyrus sheets and wooden boards that have long since returned to dust. The Nile Valley's preservation conditions, while excellent for many organic materials, are not perfect. Wood can survive under specific circumstances. Papyrus can last for millennia in dry sand. But both materials are vulnerable to humidity, flooding, bacterial decay, and the countless small destructions that accumulate over thousands of years. A century or two of experimental writing on perishable materials could easily have vanished without leaving any recoverable evidence. Yet even this explanation, compelling as it may be, leaves uncomfortable questions unanswered. The sudden appearance of not just writing, but a complete symbolic vocabulary capable of expressing the complex concepts of divine kingship, administrative control, and ceremonial authority suggests that more than simple literacy emerged in early dynastic Egypt. The hieroglyphic system appears alongside a fully developed royal iconography, standardized artistic conventions, and sophisticated administrative practices that seem to have materialized simultaneously. This convergence of complex innovations points toward a different possibility. That writing was not an isolated invention, but part of a larger package of cultural and administrative technologies that appeared together at the dawn of Egyptian civilization. If these systems were developed elsewhere by a predecessor culture whose material remains have not yet been identified, then their sudden appearance in Egypt might represent not indigenous innovation, but cultural inheritance. The museum closes each evening, leaving these ancient artifacts in darkness that mirrors our incomplete understanding of their true significance. The hieroglyphs wait patiently in their climate-controlled cases, holding secrets that may never be fully revealed. Tomorrow, researchers will continue their careful analysis of these enigmatic inscriptions, hoping to extract new meaning from ancient symbols. Yet the fundamental question remains unchanged. Are we looking at Egypt's first words, or are we witnessing the preservation of a much older language? The midday sun strikes the granite walls of the Valley Temple at Giza with an intensity that would blind you, if not for the precision of its ancient builders. Standing before these massive stone blocks, some rising higher than your shoulders and weighing more than 70 tons, what strikes you first is not their immense size, but the uncanny perfection of their assembly. Edge to edge, block to block, the joints between these colossal stones are so tight that no tool can slip between them. Constructed around 25 and 70 BC, the stonework seems to mock the passage of time. The surfaces remain so precisely flat after 45 centuries. Under the harsh Egyptian sun, the granite glints as it catches and holds light, transforming these monuments from mere buildings into something approaching sculpture. These monuments represent not the culmination of centuries of architectural development, but something far stranger. They appear to mark the very beginning of Egypt's experimentation with large-scale stone construction. It's as if the builders had somehow skipped the entire learning process and arrived at mastery without leaving any trace of how they got there. Just a few centuries before these temples and pyramids rose from the desert sands, construction along the Nile Valley relied almost exclusively on mud brick and small irregular field stones gathered from surface deposits. These earlier buildings housed families, stored grain-marked sacred spaces. Mud brick construction required only the most basic tools: wooden forms to shape the bricks, simple implements to mix clay and straw, human labor to lift and place the finished blocks. The techniques had been refined over generations of practical use, but they remained fundamentally limited by the properties of the materials themselves. Mud brick buildings were vulnerable to rain, prone to gradual erosion, and entirely unsuitable for the kind of monumental construction that would soon define Egyptian civilization. The architectural record from this earlier period shows no hint of the revolutionary transformation that was coming. There are no surviving monuments from the late pre-dynastic period that demonstrate experimentation with larger stone blocks, more precise cutting techniques, or more ambitious structural engineering. The technological leap from irregular field stone foundations to precisely cut granite assemblies appears to have occurred not gradually over generations, but suddenly within the span of a few decades. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, constructed around 2670 BC during the Third Dynasty, stands as the earliest known large-scale stone construction in Egypt. Its six-tiered form dominates the desert horizon even today. The limestone blocks of Jose's pyramid are not roughly shaped field stones, but carefully cut rectangular stones, each fitted to its neighbors, with joints measured in millimi rather than centimi. The walls rise in perfectly straight lines, their angles calculated with mathematical precision, their surfaces smooth enough to reflect light evenly across their entire expanse. This represents not an incremental improvement over earlier construction techniques, but a fundamental transformation in how stone could be worked, moved, and assembled into permanent structures. Even more remarkable is what followed. Within just a few decades of Jose's experimental pyramid, Egyptian builders had progressed to constructing the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, a monument that pushes the boundaries of what seems technically possible even by today's standards. The original structure rose nearly 147 mem into the sky. Its polished limestone casing stones fitted together so precisely that the entire surface reflected sunlight like a gigantic mirror. Its base was leveled to within just 2 centimeters across a footprint covering 13 acres. The mathematical accuracy of its construction suggests a mastery of surveying and engineering that appears to have materialized from nowhere in the historical record. Beneath the Great Pyramid, in the granite chambers that house its most sacred spaces, the stonework reaches levels of precision that strain credibility. Granite beams weighing dozens of tons have been cut, transported, and positioned with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The walls of the king's chamber rise from blocks of red granite quarried at Aswan over 800 kilometers to the south, each piece shaped and polished to create seamless joints that remain perfect after more than 4,000 years. The choice of materials compounds the mystery. Limestone, while challenging to work with copper tools, can be shaped and smoothed through patient application of simple techniques. But granite, basalt, and diorite belong to a different category entirely. These igneous rocks are harder than the copper tools that archaeological evidence suggests were the primary metal implements available to Old Kingdom builders. Working such materials requires either extremely hard stone tools like thedorite pounders, found at ancient quarry sites, or techniques that leave no trace in the archaeological record. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that granite can indeed be shaped using diorite hammerstones and copper tools, but the process is extraordinarily labor-intensive and time-consuming. To rough shape a single granite block requires hundreds of hours of sustained pounding. To achieve the mirror-smooth surfaces found in monuments like the Valley Temple would demand thousands of additional hours of patient grinding and polishing. The logistics of coordinating such work across the hundreds of granite blocks found in Old Kingdom monuments suggests organizational capabilities that seem to have appeared fully formed at the very beginning of Egypt's stone-building period. More troubling still is the pattern of technological development that follows these early achievements. Rather than continuing to refine and improve upon the techniques demonstrated in the Great Pyramid, later Egyptian monuments often show clear evidence of declining precision and ambition. The pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties are smaller in scale, their internal construction less carefully executed, their casing stones fitted with wider gaps and rougher finishes. The Pyramid of Unas, last king of the 5th dynasty, contains the first appearance of pyramid texts, but the stonework itself shows clear signs of reduced technical capability. The core blocks are more irregularly shaped. The joints between stones are wider, and the overall precision of construction falls noticeably short of what had been achieved 2 centuries earlier. Rather than representing a natural progression from crude beginnings to refined mastery, Egypt's architectural record suggests an early peak followed by gradual decline. The mystery deepens when one considers the broader context of technological development in the ancient world. Most civilizations show clear patterns of gradual improvement in their construction techniques, each generation building upon the achievements of their predecessors, slowly refining methods, gradually increasing the scale and precision of their projects. Egypt's stone architecture appears to violate this pattern by beginning not with crude experiments, but with monuments that represent the peak of technical achievement. The absence of transitional monuments becomes particularly troubling when viewed against the background of what such a technological leap would have required. Moving from mud brick construction to precision granite work involves not just new tools and techniques, but entirely new systems of organization, training, quality control, and project management. The Great Pyramid required an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, each cut, transported, and positioned according to an overall plan of extraordinary precision. Such coordination suggests institutional knowledge and organizational capabilities that typically develop over centuries, not decades. Yet, the archaeological record provides no evidence of this developmental period. There are no partially successful experimental pyramids, no monuments that show the gradual refinement of cutting techniques. The technical capabilities required for Old Kingdom monuments appear to have been available from the beginning, as if they had been inherited rather than developed, imported rather than invented. Whether this knowledge came from an earlier Egyptian tradition that has not survived in the archaeological record or from contact with other cultures. As the sun sets behind the pyramids of Giza, casting long shadows across granite, blocks that have held their positions for 45 centuries, the monuments seem to hold their secrets as closely as they hold their massive stones. The story these monuments tell is note of gradual progress from primitive to sophisticated. This is a tale of capabilities that appeared at the beginning of recorded history and then slowly faded, leaving behind only the evidence of what had once been possible and the persistent question of where such knowledge had originally come from. On the Giza Plateau, beneath the pale light of a nearly morning sun that has risen over this landscape for countless millennia, the Great Pyramid stands, exactly where ancient builders placed it, more than 4,500 years ago. Its limestone blocks have been dulled by wind and time, stripped of their original polished casing stones by later generations who needed building material for Cairo's growing neighborhoods. Yet, despite these surface changes, the monument's essential geometry remains unaltered. 4 massive triangular faces rising from a precisely oriented square base, each edge extending across the desert floor toward distant horizons that seem to mark the very limits of the known world. From ground level, the pyramid scale dominates everything around it. Its bulk so enormous that it warps your sense of perspective and makes the people walking near its base appear ant-like in comparison. But it is from above, through aerial photographs or satellite imagery, that the monument's most extraordinary characteristic becomes visible. The Great Pyramid's four sides form an almost perfect square aligned with mathematical precision to the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Each face of the pyramid points toward these fundamental coordinates with an accuracy that approaches the limits of what modern surveying equipment can measure. The precision of this alignment is difficult to grasp without understanding the technical challenges involved. The pyramid's orientation to true north deviates by less than 4 arc minutes, a measurement so small that it represents less than 115th of a single degree. To put this in perspective, if you were to stand at the pyramid's base and sight along its northern edge toward the horizon, the error would be virtually invisible to the naked eye. Even with modern GPS technology and laser-guided surveying equipment, achieving such accuracy across a structure covering 13 acres requires careful measurement and multiple confirmations. What makes this precision truly remarkable is not just its absolute accuracy, but its place in the historical sequence of Egyptian pyramid construction. The Great Pyramid was built during the 4th dynasty reign of Pharaoh Khufu, around 2580 BC, making it one of the earliest attempts at true pyramid construction on this massive scale. Yet none of the pyramids built afterward, despite centuries of additional experience and refinement, match its orientational accuracy. Later dynasties continued to build imposing monuments, but their builders seem to have lost the precise surveying techniques that made Khufu's achievement possible. This pattern defies the normal expectations of technological development. In most fields of human endeavor, we see gradual improvement over time as techniques are refined, tools are perfected, and knowledge accumulates across generations. The story of Egyptian pyramid buildings should show increasing precision as builders learned from previous mistakes and developed better methods. Instead, we see the opposite: a peak of accuracy achieved early in the sequence, followed by a gradual decline in precision that suggests the loss rather than the improvement of critical knowledge. The technical challenges involved in achieving such precise alignment cannot be overstated. Ancient Egyptian builders had no magnetic compasses. Those would not be invented for thousands of years, and even if they had possessed such instruments, magnetic north and true north are not the same thing. Magnetic north shifts over time and varies by location, making it an unreliable reference for permanent construction. The pyramid builders had to determine true north through astronomical observation using the movements of celestial bodies to establish their reference points. Egyptologists have proposed several methods that might have been used to achieve this precision. One possibility involves tracking the rising and setting points of specific stars over the course of a year using the intersection of these sightlines to establish true north. Another approach might have involved observing the sun's position at the exact moments of the spring and autumn equinoxes when day and night are of equal length and the sun rises precisely in the east and sets precisely in the west. A third method could have used circumpolar stars, those that never set below the horizon, to establish a north-south reference line by tracking their circular paths around the celestial pole. Each of these astronomical techniques is theoretically capable of providing the accuracy demonstrated in the Great Pyramid's alignment, but implementing them in practice would have required extraordinary skill and patience. Accurate stellar observations demand clear skies, stable sighting instruments, and measurements taken over extended periods to account for atmospheric effects and observational errors. The coordination of such work, across the months or years required to establish the pyramid's foundation points, would have necessitated a level of systematic organization and technical expertise that seems remarkably advanced for such an early period in Egyptian history. The sophistication required for this achievement becomes even more apparent when we consider the practical constraints faced by the ancient builders. The Giza Plateau, while elevated above the Nile Valley, is no tan ideal astronomical observatory. Desert conditions create atmospheric disturbances that can affect the apparent positions of stars, particularly those near the horizon. Dust and heat shimmer can make precise measurements difficult, especially during the day when solar observations would have been necessary. The builders would have needed not only sophisticated observational techniques, but also methods for correcting these environmental effects to achieve the accuracy we see in the finished monument. This absence of evidence for the surveying methods creates an uncomfortable gap in our understanding of Egyptian technological capabilities. We can see the extraordinary result, a monument aligned to true north with almost unimaginable precision, but we cannot fully explain how it was achieved. The mathematical and observational skills required seem to present a quantum leap beyond what the archaeological record suggests was available at the time. Either Egyptian astronomers and surveyors possessed knowledge and techniques that have left no other traces, or they inherited methods developed elsewhere and applied them without fully understanding their theoretical foundations. If the Great Pyramid's builders had developed their surveying techniques through systematic experimentation and theoretical understanding, we would expect to see that knowledge preserved and transmitted to subsequent generations. Instead, the evidence suggests that critical information was somehow lost, leaving later builders to work with incomplete understanding of the methods their predecessors had employed. The symbolic significance of the Great Pyramid's precision adds another layer to the mystery. In Egyptian cosmology, the cardinal directions held profound religious meaning. North was associated with the circumpolar stars that never set, representing the eternal and unchanging realm of the gods. East and west marked the daily journey of the sun, god Ra, across the sky. South connected to the source of the Nile and the life-giving floods that sustained Egyptian civilization. By aligning their most important monument to these cosmic directions, the builders were not simply demonstrating technical skill, but creating a sacred space that participated in the fundamental order of the universe. This religious dimension suggests that the surveying techniques used for the Great Pyramid were not merely technical tools, but part of a comprehensive understanding of the relationship between earthly architecture and celestial order. The precision of the alignment was not an end in itself, but a means of creating a monument that would serve as a permanent link between the human and divine worlds. Such integration of technical and spiritual knowledge typically develops over long periods within stable cultural traditions. Yet, the archaeological record provides little evidence of the gradual development that should have preceded such sophisticated achievement. The mystery deepens when we consider that the knowledge that made such precision possible seems to have been available for only a brief period in Egyptian history, emerging suddenly in the Fourth Dynasty and then gradually disappearing from the archaeological record. Whether that knowledge was developed through indigenous Egyptian innovation or inherited from an earlier tradition remains one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries. In either case, the monument serves as a reminder that the ancient world contained capabilities that continue to challenge our assumptions about the development of human knowledge. The Great Pyramid stands as both a monument to human achievement and a marker of the limits of our understanding. Its alignment will outlast the civilizations that have studied it, its orientation remaining true long after. The last tourist has departed, and the last archaeologist has published their final paper. Walk through the ancient temples of Egypt with careful eyes, and you will begin to notice something that most visitors miss entirely. At first glance, the massive stone walls appear uniform, solid barriers of limestone, sandstone, or granite that have stood against wind and sand for thousands of years. But as your vision adjusts to the subtle variations in color, texture, and finish, the seams begin to reveal themselves. Here, a single block rises taller than a person, its surface dressed to mirror-like smoothness that seems to swallow light rather than reflect it. There, beside it, newer stones appear, smaller and rougher, their edges bearing the scars of hasty chiseling, their joints filled with mortar to compensate for imperfect fitting. This phenomenon becomes particularly striking in some of Egypt's most famous monuments. At the Temple of Karnak, sections of wall display a jarring contrast between massive blocks of red granite, precisely cut and fitted with joints so tight that no mortar was needed, and smaller stones of local sandstone that show clear signs of hurried workmanship. The granite blocks tower over their newer neighbors, their surfaces polished to a perfection that makes them seem almost metallic in certain light. Meanwhile, the sandstone additions, while structurally sound, display a noticeably different standard of craftsmanship: rougher surfaces, wider joints, and a general sense of expedience over excellence. Archaeological investigation has documented this pattern throughout Egypt, where later dynasties consistently reused stone blocks from earlier monuments during their own construction and restoration projects. The practice appears logical at first. Quarrying fresh granite from Aswan or extracting high-quality limestone from distant quarries required enormous investments of time, labor, and resources. Reusing existing blocks of superior stone would have represented significant savings in both cost and effort, making it an obvious choice for practical builders working within limited budgets. Yet when examined more closely, many of these reused cases reveal puzzling characteristics that challenge simple economic explanations. In numerous instances, the reused blocks are not just convenient building material, but represent standards of craftsmanship that the later builders seem unable to match. The older stones are often made from harder materials: granite instead of limestone, basalt instead of sandstone, worked to tolerances and finishes that exceed anything found in the contemporary portions of the same structures. This raises an uncomfortable question that strikes at the heart of our understanding of Egyptian technological development. Why would builders with the resources and manpower to move massive stone blocks across great distances not possess the skills to create equivalent replacements? If later dynasties could organize the labor needed to transport and position 70-ton granite blocks in their own construction projects, why did they not simply quarry and prepare new blocks of similar quality? The standard explanation focuses on economic efficiency. Reusing existing superior blocks save time and resources that could be directed toward other aspects of construction. This reasoning works well for cases where builders incorporated random blocks salvaged from ruined structures. But it becomes less convincing when we examine instances where the reused blocks clearly represent a different technological tradition, displaying techniques and finishing standards that appear beyond the capabilities of their new users. Consider the massive granite blocks that form the lower courses of certain walls at Karnak. These stones show evidence of cutting and polishing techniques that produce surfaces flat to within fractions of millimeters across spans of several meters. The edges are cut to perfect right angles, the joints between blocks fitted so precisely that modern tools can barely detect the seams. Yet the blocks that were added during later restoration phases, while competently executed, show wider tolerances, rougher finishes, and clear evidence of different working methods. The contrast becomes even more striking when we examine the types of stone involved. Many of the reused blocks are carved from materials that are significantly harder than the contemporary additions. Granite and basalt require specialized tools and techniques for effective working. Copper tools, the primary metal implements available to ancient Egyptian builders, barely scratched the surface of such hard stones. Working them to the precision levels visible in the reused blocks demands either extensive use of abrasive techniques or access to cutting methods that leave little trace in the archaeological record. This technological disparity suggests that the reuse of older blocks represents more than mere convenience. It may indicate that later builders recognized standards of craftsmanship they could observe but not reproduce. If the techniques required to work hard stone to such exacting tolerances were no longer fully understood, then incorporating existing examples becomes less a choice than a necessity. The alternative would have been to accept significantly lower standards for new construction or to abandon the use of hard stone entirely. Archaeological evidence from various sites supports this interpretation of declining technical capabilities over time. At Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Rome's III, careful examination reveals a clear stratification of construction quality. The temple's foundation and lower courses incorporate massive blocks of the highest craftsmanship with surfaces, finished to near perfection and joints fitted with extraordinary precision. Higher up, where latter additions and repairs are more common, the stonework shows progressively looser tolerances and rougher finishing. Similar patterns appear at sites throughout Egypt, from the great temples of Luxor to smaller provincial monuments. The seams between old and new construction create visible timelines of Egyptian building technology, and those timelines suggest decline rather than improvement. In most fields of human endeavor, we see steady improvement over time as techniques are refined, tools are improved. Egyptian stonework appears to follow the opposite pattern. Early achievement of extraordinary standards followed by gradual loss of the capabilities that made such achievement possible. If later dynasties were indeed unable to match the technical standards achieved by their predecessors, it suggests that critical knowledge was somehow lost or incompletely transmitted across generations. Such loss typically occurs during periods of political upheaval, economic collapse, or cultural disruption, conditions that can interrupt the normal processes by which specialized knowledge passes from master craftsmen to their apprentices. Yet, the historical record provides little evidence of disruption severe enough to account for such widespread loss of technical capability. Egyptian civilization, while certainly experiencing periods of political fragmentation and economic difficulty, maintained remarkable cultural continuity across the millennia of pharaonic rule. The same religious traditions, artistic conventions, and architectural forms persisted with only gradual changes through dynasty after dynasty. How could such a stable culture lose the specific technical knowledge needed to work stone at the highest levels while preserving so much else? One possibility is that the knowledge in question was never fully Egyptian to begin with. If early Egyptian builders had access to techniques developed by predecessor culture, they might have been able to apply those methods without fully understanding the theoretical principles underlying them. When that inherited knowledge became corrupted or incomplete through normal processes of transmission across generations, later builders would have been left with examples of what had once been possible, but without the detailed understanding needed to recreate it. This interpretation transforms the reused blocks from simple building materials into something far more significant: physical evidence of technological inheritance. Each precisely cut granite block, each perfectly fitted joint, each mirror smooth surface becomes a fragment of a technological tradition whose origins lie beyond the reach of current archaeological investigation. At Karach, as afternoon light strikes the great walls at an angle that emphasizes the differences in surface texture, the contrast between old and new construction becomes particularly vivid. This visual contrast extends beyond mere aesthetics to fundamental questions about how civilizations maintain and transmit their technical knowledge. As visitors walk through these ancient temples today, most see only the unified whole, impressive monuments that speak to the architectural achievements of ancient Egypt. Those who look more carefully, however, can read in the stones themselves a more complex story of inheritance and loss of standards achieved and then gradually abandoned. The seams in Egypt's walls mark more than architectural history. They trace the visible boundaries between what was remembered and what was lost, between inherited achievement and indigenous capability. In those boundaries lies the story of a civilization that built upon foundations it did not fully understand. These mismatched stones offer perhaps the most tangible evidence for the central mystery that underlies Egypt's architectural achievements. In the Temple of Abydos, within the sacred chambers that Seti, the first dedicated to the gods of ancient Egypt, there stands a wall that seems to offer one of history's greatest gifts, a complete record of Egyptian kingship carved in imperishable stone. The limestone surface has been polished to mirror smoothness. its hieroglyphic inscriptions as crisp today as when royal scribes first chiseled them into the wall nearly 3,000 years ago. Across this pristine surface, 76 royal carts march in perfect sequence, each one enclosing the names and titles of pharaohs who ruled Egypt from its earliest dynasties through Seti's own reign in the 19th dynasty. The scene depicted in the relief is one of profound reverence and continuity. Seti I himself stands before the wall of names, his figure carved with the confident proportions and elegant detail that characterize the finest art of the new kingdom. Beside him, his young son, the future Ames, mirrors his father's posture of respect before the royal ancestors. Together they present offerings to the endless line of kings whose cartouches fill the wall, creating a visual dialogue between the living and the dead that spans over a millennium of Egyptian history. At first encounter, the Abydos-king list appears to be exactly what any historian would pray to discover: an ancient civilization's own authoritative record of its rulers, preserved in the most permanent medium available and displayed in one of Egypt's most sacred locations. Here, carved in stone and blessed by the gods, is what seems to be the definitive genealogy of pharaonic power, stretching back through the Middle Kingdom, the Old Kingdom, and into the shadowy reaches of Egypt's earliest dynasties. No modern scholar could ask for better primary source material. Yet, the longer one studies this remarkable monument, the more troubling certain absences become. The list presents itself as comprehensive, but careful comparison with other historical sources reveals that numerous significant rulers have been omitted entirely. The gaps are not random. They follow patterns that suggest deliberate editorial choices rather than accidental oversights or damage to the monument. Entire reigns that left major marks on Egyptian history have been edited out of this official record, creating a version of the past that is as notable for what it excludes as for what it preserves. Among the most striking omissions is Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled Egypt for over 20 years during the 18th dynasty. Hatshepsut was one of Egypt's most successful rulers, presiding over a period of prosperity, architectural achievement, and peaceful trade that brought unprecedented wealth to the kingdom. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari remains one of Egypt's architectural masterpieces. Her trading expeditions to the land of Punt are depicted in detailed reliefs, and her reign represents one of the high points of New Kingdom civilization. Yet in the Abydos king list, it is as if she never existed. The succession moves directly from her predecessor to her successor, creating a seamless narrative that eliminates her 2 decades of rule entirely. Even more dramatically absent is Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, whose radical religious reforms transformed Egypt during the late 18th dynasty. Akhenaten abandoned Egypt's traditional polytheistic religion in favor of worshipping a single deity. The sun disk Aten moved the capital to a new city called Akheton and revolutionized Egyptian art and culture in ways that still fascinate scholars. Today, his reign was one of the most consequential in Egyptian history, yet the Abydos king list jumps from Amenhotep III directly to Tutankhamun, erasing not only Akhenaten, but also the other rulers associated with the Amarna period. The list also excludes the Hyksos rulers, who controlled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. These foreign kings, whose name means rulers of foreign lands, established a dynasty that governed Lower Egypt for over a century, introducing new military technologies like horse-drawn chariots and composite bows that would later be adopted by Egyptian forces. While their rule was eventually ended by Theban pharaohs who reunified Egypt under native control, the Hyksos period was a significant chapter in Egyptian history that shaped the kingdom's subsequent development. Yet none of these foreign rulers appears in the Abydos list, which presents an unbroken sequence of native Egyptian pharaohs as if the Hyksos interlude had never occurred. Egyptologists have long recognized that these omissions were politically motivated, reflecting the ideological purposes that the king list was designed to serve. The monument was not intended as an objective historical record, but as a celebration of legitimate pharaonic succession, a visual argument for the continuity and divine sanction of Egyptian kingship. Rulers who were considered illegitimate, foreign, or religiously dangerous could be excluded from this official narrative without compromising its essential message. In fact, their exclusion might strengthen the list's ideological impact by presenting a purified version of Egyptian history that eliminated inconvenient complications. This practice of deliberate historical editing was not unique to the Abydos king list. Throughout Egyptian history, rulers routinely removed the names and images of predecessors whose reigns they wished to disavow. The process was known as damnatio memoriale, the condemnation of memory, and it represented one of the most serious punishments that could be inflicted on a former ruler. In Egyptian belief, existence in the afterlife depended upon the preservation of one's name and image in the world of the living. By systematically erasing thus the elements from monuments and records, later pharaohs could effectively condemn their predecessors to a second death that would erase them from both history and eternity. Yet while the political motivations behind some omissions are clear, the practice of historical editing raises more troubling questions about the completeness of our knowledge of Egyptian history. If well-documented rulers like Hatshepsut and Akhenaten could be systematically erased from official records, how many other pharaohs might have suffered similar treatment? How many names have been removed so thoroughly that modern scholars have no way of knowing they ever existed? Archaeological evidence suggests that such erasures were not merely theoretical possibilities, but documented historical practices. Excavations. Throughout Egypt have uncovered fragments of monuments bearing royal names that appear in Noking list. Carts of rulers who left physical traces of their reigns, but were subsequently written out of official history. These discoveries hinted a shadow history of forgotten pharaohs whose reigns were deemed unsuitable for inclusion in the authorized versions of Egyptian succession. The most disturbing possibility is that some of these forgotten rulers might have belonged to an earlier phase of Egyptian civilization whose achievements later dynasties found inconvenient to acknowledge. If Egypt was indeed built upon the foundations of an older, more technically advanced culture, later pharaohs might have had compelling reasons to obscure that inheritance. Acknowledging predecessor civilizations would have undermined claims of Egyptian uniqueness and divine legitimacy that formed the core of pharaonic ideology. What if some of Egypt's greatest architectural and technological achievements, such as the precision of the Great Pyramid and the sophisticated engineering of Old Kingdom monuments, were actually inherited from pre-dynastic civilizations? It's possible that these civilizations' existence had been systematically erased from official records. The pharaohs who accomplished this erasure would not necessarily have been acting from malice, but from the political necessity of establishing clear legitimacy for their own rule. Such systematic historical revision would explain many of the puzzling aspects of early Egyptian civilization that we have already encountered. The sudden appearance of complex technologies without clear developmental histories, the early peaks of achievement followed by gradual decline, the evidence of inherited rather than indigenous knowledge. All of these patterns could result from a civilization that had deliberately obscured its own origins while preserving selected elements of earlier achievements. The Abydos king list, viewed from this perspective, becomes more than a simple roster of pharaohs. It represents a curated version of Egyptian history designed to support a particular narrative about the kingdom's origins and development. In the gaps between the listed pharaohs lie the shadows of erased reigns, forgotten dynasties, and perhaps entire civilizations whose memory was deemed too dangerous to preserve. Standing before this monument today, watching how the afternoon light catches the precisely carved hieroglyphs, one cannot escape the sense that the wall holds more secrets than it reveals. Each carto, a decision about which parts of Egypt's past deserved to be remembered and which were better left in the silence of deliberate forgetting. The craftsmen who carved these inscriptions were not simply recording history. They were actively constructing it, creating a version of the past that would serve the political and religious needs of their present. Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to provide glimpses of these erased chapters of Egyptian history. Excavations at sites throughout Egypt continue to uncover evidence of rulers, dynasties, and even entire periods that appear in no official king list. These discoveries suggest that the authorized versions of Egyptian history, preserved in monuments like the Abydos king, list represent only a fraction of the kingdom's actual past. The rest lies buried, sometimes literally, beneath layers of later construction and official silence. The Temple of Abydos closes each evening, leaving the king list in darkness that mirrors our incomplete understanding of Egyptian history. The list stands as both a monument to Egyptian memory and a testament to Egyptian forgetting. The pharaohs who appear on this wall earned their place through political acceptability as much as historical significance, while those who were excluded may have been erased precisely because their stories threatened the authorized version of Egyptian origins that later dynasties wished to preserve. In the climate-controlled chambers of the world's great museums, behind protective glass that filters out the harmful wavelengths of modern lighting, there lie fragments of stone and papyrus that contain some of history's most puzzling claims. Carved into black basalt and inked onto ancient papyrus are names that seem to belong nowhere in the accepted chronology of human civilization. Rulers whose very existence challenges our understanding of when history begins and where mythology ends. These are not the familiar pharaohs whose monuments still rise from Egypt's sands, nor are they the legendary gods whose stories filled ancient temples. They occupy a strange middle ground recorded as historical figures, yet attributed with characteristics that seem to transcend human limitations. The Egyptians themselves called them the Shemu, the followers of Horus. They appear in some of the oldest surviving king lists as rulers who governed Egypt in the shadowy period before the establishment of the first dynasty, circa 3100 BC. Their reigns are recorded with the same careful attention to detail that characterizes other historical records. Yet the numbers associated with their rule strain credibility. Some are said to have governed for 300 years, others for 400, and a few for even longer periods that blur the boundary between historical record and mythological narrative. The most important evidence for these mysterious rulers comes from monuments that rank among Egypt's earliest historical documents. The Palma Stone, a black basalt slab that preserves fragments of what may be Egypt's oldest comprehensive king list, devotes considerable space to the Shu, despite the fact that most of the stone has been lost or damaged over the millennia. What survives shows careful attention to chronological detail, with each ruler's reign length recorded in the same format used for later historically verified pharaohs. The Tin King List, a papyrus document from the New Kingdom period, similarly includes the Shemu in its comprehensive catalog of Egyptian rulers, treating them as legitimate historical figures rather than mythological constructs. Yet, the information preserved about these pre-dynastic rulers present immediate problems for anyone attempting to understand them as historical figures in the conventional sense. The reign lengths attributed to individual Shemuhor rulers are not just unusually long, but impossibly so by normal human standards, even allowing for the possibility that ancient chronological systems might have worked differently than modern ones. The numbers recorded for these figures suggest lifespans and periods of rule that exceed what biology would allow for normal human beings. This chronological impossibility has led most modern scholars to interpret the Shamsu as mythological figures, legendary rulers whose stories were invented to fill the gap between divine creation and historical human rule. According to this interpretation, the enormous reign lengths represent symbolic rather than literal time periods, perhaps reflecting the ancient Egyptian conception of a primordial age when time itself operated according to different principles than those governing the historical period. Yet this mythological interpretation struggles against several uncomfortable facts about how the Shamsu appear in ancient sources. Unlike purely mythological figures, they are not typically associated with supernatural deeds or divine interventions in the natural world. Their names appear in sober historical contexts, integrated into king lists that otherwise maintain clear distinctions between legendary and historical periods. Most significantly, ancient Egyptian scribes took considerable trouble to preserve and transmit information about these figures across thousands of years, treating them as legitimate parts of Egypt's royal heritage rather than as entertaining, but irrelevant mythological curiosities. The decision to include the Shemuhor in official king lists represents a deliberate editorial choice that reflects how ancient Egyptians understood their own history. The scribes who compiled these documents were working under royal patronage, creating authoritative records that would serve political and religious purposes for their contemporary audience. Every name included in such lists carried implications for dynastic legitimacy and divine sanction. The presence of the Shem-Suhor in these contexts suggests that they served important functions in ancient Egyptian historical consciousness, providing a necessary link between the mythological age of divine rule and the historical period of human kingship. This intermediate position becomes clearer when we examine how the Shemu fit into broader patterns of ancient Egyptian historical narrative. Egyptian tradition held that the world had originally been ruled directly by the gods' figures like Tar, Ra, Osiris, Seth, and Horus, who established the fundamental principles of cosmic and social order. This divine rule was followed by a period of semi-divine kingship, when the gods' direct descendants or chosen representatives governed Egypt while maintaining connections to the divine realm. Only after this transitional period did purely human pharaohs assume power, beginning the dynastic sequence that modern historians recognize as Egyptian history proper. The Shamsu occupy the crucial transitional phase in this narrative, serving as the bridge between divine and human rule. They are depicted as followers or servants of Horus, the falcon god who became the divine prototype of Pharaonic kingship. Yet they're also presented as historical rulers who governed real territories and exercised actual political power. This dual nature, simultaneously mythological and historical, may reflect the ancient Egyptian understanding that legitimate kingship required both divine sanction and practical political capability. Recent archaeological discoveries have begun to provide tantalizing hints that the Shamsu tradition might preserve distorted memories of actual historical developments rather than purely mythological constructions. Excavations at Heracompolis, Abydos, and other sites associated with Egypt's pre-dynastic period have revealed evidence of complex political and social organization that predates the traditional beginning of Egyptian history by several centuries. These discoveries suggest that sophisticated leadership structures existed in the Nile Valley long before the emergence of the unified Egyptian state, providing a possible historical foundation for traditions about pre-dynastic rulers. The archaeological evidence from pre-dynastic Egypt reveals a landscape dotted with independent chiefdoms and proto-urban centers, each governed by local elites who controlled trade networks, organized large-scale construction projects, and maintained armies capable of territorial conquest. These leaders left behind elaborate tombs, sophisticated artwork, and evidence of long-distance trade connections that suggest political and economic capabilities approaching those of later pharaohs. While we cannot directly connect these archaeological traces to the specific names preserved in the Shamsu tradition, they demonstrate that the pre-dynastic period was far from the primitive or chaotic era that older scholarly models suggested. This archaeological context transforms our understanding of what the Shamsu tradition might represent, rather than purely mythological figures invented to fill an embarrassing gap in historical knowledge. They may preserve the names and reputations of actual pre-dynastic rulers. The impossibly long reign lengths attributed to these figures might reflect the compression of multiple generations of rule under single names, or the tendency of oral tradition to exaggerate the achievements and longevity of particularly memorable leaders. If Egypt was indeed a civilization that rebuilt upon the foundations of earlier achievements, rather than developing its capabilities through purely indigenous innovation, then the Shu tradition might preserve crucial information about the political structures that governed those earlier achievements. The pre-dynastic rulers commemorated in this tradition might have been the last leaders of the older civilization whose technical and organizational capabilities later pharaohs inherited and attempted to reconstruct. The fragmentary nature of our evidence about the Shemsu reflects the broader challenges involved in reconstructing the earliest phases of Egyptian civilization. Unlike later historical periods which left behind abundant written records and monumental inscriptions, the pre-dynastic era remains largely silent in terms of contemporary documentation. We must piece together its story from archaeological fragments, scattered references in later texts. Even if the specific details about individual Shemuhor rulers cannot be verified through independent sources, their presence in official king lists indicates that ancient Egyptians understood their own civilization as the heir to much older political and cultural traditions. The pharaohs did not see themselves as the founders of Egyptian civilization, but as its restorers, continuing work that had been begun by predecessors. The temple inscriptions and papyrus documents that preserve references to the Shamsu continue to rest in their climate-controlled environments. The civilization they describe, a pre-dynastic Egypt governed by rulers whose reigns stretched across centuries, remains tantalizingly beyond the reach of definitive historical reconstruction. We can read the names, study the chronologies, and analyze the contexts in which these traditions appear. But we cannot fully recover the historical realities they may represent. In the end, the Shemuhor serve as fitting symbols for the central mystery that runs throughout Egyptian civilization. The question of whether its greatest achievements represent indigenous innovation or the inheritance and reconstruction of older traditions whose origins remain hidden in the shadows of prehistory. It points toward a past that was already ancient when Egypt's documented history began a time before kings, when the foundations were laid for all that would follow. In the shadowed halls of Egypt's great temples, where filtered sunlight streams through, narrow openings to illuminate walls of polished sandstone and granite, the earliest scenes of kingship do not depict mortal rulers at all. Instead, they show gods seated upon thrones wearing the regalia of sovereignty, receiving offerings with the same formal dignity that would later characterize Pharaonic portraiture. Horus stands with a double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, resting. Upon his falcon head, his wings spread in protective gesture over the land. Osiris sits in eternal judgment, holding the crook and flail, the fundamental symbols of rulership, while his green skin speaks of death transformed into eternal life. They, with the curved beak of an ibis, grasps the writing palette and reed that make him master of knowledge and time itself. These are not abstract theological concepts rendered in stone, but portraits of rulers depicted with the same visual language that Egyptian artists would later use for historical pharaohs. The gods wear the same crowns, hold the same ceremonial objects, and maintain the same rigid postures of authority that define royal iconography throughout Egyptian history. Their presence in these temple reliefs suggests something more concrete than theological speculation. They represent Egyptian tradition's own understanding of how civilization began, not with human innovation, but with divine instruction. According to the mythological traditions preserved in Egyptian religious texts, the world's first age was governed directly by these divine beings. This was not a time of chaos or primitive struggle, but an era of perfect order when the fundamental principles of civilized life were established once and for all. The gods did not merely create the world. They organized it, bringing systems and structures that would provide the foundation for all subsequent human development. Their rule was remembered not as distant prehistory, but as the golden age when the templates for civilization were first established. The myths surrounding these divine rulers read less like religious allegories and more like administrative records of cultural innovation. Osiris is credited with introducing agriculture to Egypt, teaching people how to cultivate grain, produce bread, and brew beer. More significantly, he established the legal and social frameworks that allowed agricultural communities to function peacefully, creating the first laws and the first principles of just governance. Thoth's contributions were equally fundamental: writing, mathematics, astronomy, and the measurement of time. These were not mystical gifts, but practical technologies, the essential tools that make complex civilization possible. Horus represented something different but equally crucial: the principle of legitimate authority itself. In Egyptian tradition, every pharaoh was understood to be the living embodiment of Horus, the earthly representative of divine order. But Horus himself was remembered as the original king, the prototype, from which all subsequent rulership derived its legitimacy. His mythology provided not just religious validation for pharaonic power, but a constitutional framework that defined how authority should operate within the constraints of cosmic order. What makes these mythological traditions particularly intriguing is how closely they align with archaeological evidence about the sudden appearance of complex systems in early dynastic Egypt. The first dynasty pharaohs wrote in hieroglyphic script that was already fully developed, displaying the same complexity and sophistication that would characterize Egyptian writing for the next 3 millennia. Early agricultural practices showed advanced understanding of irrigation, crop rotation, and soil management that suggests generations of accumulated knowledge rather than recent innovation. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge required for pyramid construction and temple alignment appeared to be available from the very beginning of documented Egyptian history. This pattern of early complexity challenges conventional models of civilizational development, which typically show gradual progression from simple to sophisticated systems over extended periods. If Osiris, Thoth, and Horus were purely mythological figures, we might expect to see clear evidence of the slow development of the technologies and institutions they supposedly provided. Instead, we find systems that appear fully formed in the earliest historical records, as if they had indeed been inherited from earlier sources, rather than developed through indigenous experimentation. The possibility that these divine figures preserve mythologized memories of actual historical innovators gain support when we examine similar traditions from other ancient civilizations. Mesopotamian texts describe the upcall wise beings sent by the gods to teach the arts of civilization to humanity. These figures were credited with introducing writing, mathematics, architecture, and statecraft to the peoples of ancient Sumer and Babylon. Their descriptions blend human and divine characteristics in ways that suggest they may have been based on memories of actual cultural pioneers whose achievements were subsequently mythologized. In Mesoamerica, the figure of Quetzalcoatl played a similar role as the bringer of civilization to indigenous peoples. Credited with introducing agriculture, writing, astronomy, and governmental institutions, Quetzalcoatl was remembered as both god and culture hero, a divine teacher whose innovations provided the foundation for later civilizations. The Aztecs and other Mesoamerican peoples understood their own achievements as developments of knowledge originally provided by this semi-divine figure, rather than as purely indigenous innovations. This cross-cultural pattern of divine or semi-divine culture bringers suggests something more than coincidental mythological invention. The remarkable consistency of the sea traditions across widely separated civilizations points toward a shared human experience, the memory of receiving civilization from outside sources rather than developing it independently. Whether these sources were other human cultures, refugees from environmental catastrophes, or something else entirely, The myths preserve a common understanding that the foundations of civilized life were taught rather than discovered. The Egyptian versions of these traditions are particularly detailed and consistent, suggesting that they may preserve more specific historical memories than their counterparts in other cultures. The gods who brought order to Egypt are not generic culture heroes, but specialized figures associated with particular innovations and institutions. Osiris's connection to agriculture and law, Thoth's mastery of writing and measurement, Horus's embodiment of political authority. These represent a systematic division of civilizational knowledge. As afternoon light filters through the ancient temples, where these divine portraits still gaze from their stone walls, the boundary between mythology and history seems to blur. Whether Osiris, Horus were gods, men, or something in between may be less important than what their stories reveal about how Egyptian civilization understood its own origins. Rather than seeing themselves as the creators of their cultural achievements, the Egyptians remembered themselves as the inheritors of a legacy that extended back to the very beginning of time. Whether these teachers were gods, forgotten historical figures, or representatives of vanished civilizations may never be definitively determined. What seems clear is that Egyptian tradition, preserved in mythological form, a memory of receiving rather than creating the fundamental technologies and institutions that made their civilization possible. In the portraits of divine rulers who brought order to chaos lies evidence of ancient Egypt's own understanding that its greatest achievements were inherited gifts. Long before Alexander's conquest brought Greek rule to Egypt, when the pharaohs still held absolute sway over the Nile Valley, travelers from distant lands would journey south to witness something that defied their understanding of what human beings could build. They came not to see the pyramids, impressive thought-hose monuments, but to experience a structure so vast and intricate that their own languages lacked adequate words to describe it. Here in the Fume Depression rose what they could only call the labyrinth, a building complex that seemed to contain within its walls an entire city of halls, chambers, and corridors that stretched beyond the horizon of human memory itself. Herodotus, the Greek historian whose curiosity about the world earned him the title Father of History, visited Egypt in the 5th century BC and left us the most detailed surviving account of this extraordinary structure. His description reads, "Like the fever dream of an architect drunk on unlimited resources and infinite ambition. The labyrinth," he claimed, surpassed even the pyramids in grandeur. A statement that should give us pause given his familiarity with monuments that still rank among humanity's greatest architectural achievements. According to his careful observations, the complex contained 12 great courts, each one large enough to host the ceremonial gatherings of an entire city. These courts were roofed with massive stone slabs and surrounded by covered halls that stretched in every direction, their columns disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. The scale that Herodotus described challenges our modern understanding of what ancient engineering could accomplish. He wrote of 3,000 chambers distributed across 2 levels, 1,500 above ground and 500 below. The upper chambers were accessible to visitors, their walls covered entirely with carved reliefs that told the story of Egypt's rulers from the earliest dynasties through the present day. Every surface was inscribed with hieroglyphs, every corridor lined with statues, every hall decorated with scenes that captured the full sweep of Egyptian history in stone. To walk through these chambers was to experience a 3-dimensional encyclopedia of Egyptian civilization, where each turn revealed new chapters of the kingdom's long and complex past. The lower chambers were forbidden territory, accessible only to priests and designated only for the most sacred purposes. Here, according to Herodotus, lay the tombs of the kings who had built the labyrinth and the mummified remains of the sacred crocodiles that were worshipped as manifestations of the god Sobek. These underground halls were said to be even more elaborate than those above, their walls gleaming with precious metals and their chambers filled with treasures that represented the accumulated wealth of centuries of Egyptian rule. The very air in these subterranean spaces was thought to carry the weight of ancient secrets too powerful for ordinary mortals to witness. Later, Greek and Roman historians added their own accounts to this remarkable record. Strabo, writing in the 1st century BC, described the labyrinth's architecture in terms that emphasized its deliberately disorienting design. The complex was constructed as a series of interconnected buildings that shared walls and roofs in ways that made it impossible for visitors to maintain their sense of direction. Corridors led to other corridors. Halls opened into chambers that connected to different halls, and doorways seemed to multiply endlessly as one moved deeper into the structure. The overall effect was to create a sense of infinite space contained within finite walls, as if the architects had somehow managed to fold reality upon itself to create more room than physics should have allowed. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, provided additional details about the labyrinth's function as a repository of Egyptian knowledge. According to his account, the structure served as more than a monument or even a tomb. It was the kingdom's central archive, the place where all administrative records, historical chronicles, and religious texts were stored and maintained. Every significant event in Egyptian history was documented somewhere within its walls, every legal precedent preserved in its chambers, every religious ceremony recorded in its inscriptions. The labyrinth represented nothing less than the physical embodiment of Egyptian memory, a structure where the entire cultural heritage of the civilization was made manifest in stone. Yet, despite these detailed ancient accounts, despite the unanimous testimony of multiple independent sources, despite the clear evidence that something extraordinary once stood at Harwara, almost nothing of this magnificent complex survives today. The site that once housed what may have been the most ambitious architectural project in human history now appears as little more than scattered foundation, stones and weathered limestone blocks lying half-buried in desert sand. If you walked across the Hara site without knowledge of the ancient descriptions, you would see only the remnants of what might have been a moderately important temple complex, not the slightest hint of the vast structure that once rose from this ground. The scale of this disappearance is almost as remarkable as the original construction must have been. Buildings the size that ancient historians describe do not simply vanish without leaving substantial archaeological traces. The pyramids, despite centuries of stone robbing and deliberate destruction, still dominate the landscape where they were built. The great temples of Karnak and Luxor, though damaged and incomplete, retain enough of their original form to give modern visitors a sense of their ancient grandeur. The complete disappearance of the labyrinth represents something different, an erasure so thorough that it approaches the level of systematic destruction. Several theories have been proposed to explain this remarkable absence. The most conventional explanation suggests that the labyrinth was gradually dismantled during the Roman period and later its high-quality limestone quarried for use in other construction projects. Alexandria, Cairo, and other major cities required enormous quantities of building stone, and the labyrinth would have represented a convenient source of pre-cut blocks that could be transported relatively easily via the nearby waterways. This utilitarian destruction would have proceeded gradually, over centuries, leaving little trace of the original structure's form or purpose. A second theory focuses on environmental factors that might have led to the structure's collapse and subsequent burial. The Hara site lies within the Fiume Depression, an area that has experienced significant changes in water level over the past 2 millennia. The Bar-U Yusuf Canal, which brings Nile water into the Fiume, may have flooded the labyrinth site repeatedly, undermining foundations and causing structural failures that eventually brought down the entire complex. Desert sand, carried by persistent winds, could then have buried the ruins so completely that later generations lost track of where the structure had once stood. Yet a third possibility, more troubling in its implications, suggests that the labyrinth's destruction was deliberate, an act of systematic erasure designed to eliminate the vast archives it contained. If the complex truly served as Egypt's central repository of historical and administrative records, its destruction would have represented one of history's most catastrophic losses of cultural knowledge. More significantly, such destruction might have been motivated by political considerations, an attempt by later rulers to control what information about Egypt's past would be available to future generations. This possibility becomes particularly significant when we consider the labyrinth's construction date during the 12th dynasty, a period that marked one of the high points of Egyptian cultural achievement. Amenhotep III, the pharaoh credited with building the complex, ruled during the late Middle Kingdom, when Egypt's power, prosperity, and technological capabilities reached levels that would not be matched again for centuries. If the labyrinth's archives preserved records from this golden age and earlier periods, they might have contained information about technological and organizational capabilities that later dynasties could not match. The deliberate destruction of such archives would fit within the broader pattern of historical editing that we have observed throughout Egyptian civilization. Just as the Abydos king list omitted certain pharaohs whose reigns were deemed inappropriate for official memory, the elimination of the labyrinth's comprehensive records could have served similar purposes on a much larger scale. Rather than editing individual names from king lists, the destruction of the entire archive would have allowed complete control over what aspects of Egyptian history remained accessible to future generations. Archaeological investigation at the Hawara site has revealed tantalizing hints of what once stood there, but these fragments raise more questions than they answer. Excavations have uncovered massive foundation blocks that suggest a structure of extraordinary size, but the foundations are incomplete and their original configuration remains unclear. Scattered architectural elements, column fragments, carved reliefs, inscribed blocks provide evidence of sophisticated construction and elaborate decoration, but they are too fragmentary to reconstruct the building's original form or purpose. More disturbing is what the archaeological evidence suggests about the manner of the labyrinth's destruction. Rather than the gradual decay that would result from natural abandonment or the random damage that might result from earthquake or flood, the Hawara site shows signs of systematic dismantling. Stone blocks appear to have been carefully removed rather than simply falling where they collapsed. Architectural elements are missing entirely rather than lying broken in place. The pattern suggests organized salvage operations conducted over extended periods rather than sudden catastrophic destruction. This archaeological evidence aligns uncomfortably with historical accounts of what the labyrinth contained. If the complex truly served as Egypt's central archive, housing comprehensive records of the kingdom's history from its earliest periods, then its systematic destruction would represent one of the most devastating losses of historical knowledge in human experience. The silence that now fills the space where the labyrinth once stood carries its own message about the fragility of human knowledge and the ease with which even the most carefully preserved information can be lost. Whether through natural disaster, utilitarian destruction, or deliberate erasure, their salt is the same. A gap in the historical record that can never be filled, questions that can never be answered, and the persistent suspicion that what we know about Egyptian civilization represents only a fragment of what was once available in the context of our broader investigation into Egypt's origins and development. The vanished labyrinth takes on additional significance. If Egyptian civilization was indeed built upon the foundations of earlier achievements rather than developing purely through indigenous innovation, then the labyrinth's archives might have contained the key evidence for understanding this inheritance. The comprehensive historical records housed within its walls could have provided clear documentation of the knowledge transfer processes, technological inheritances, and cultural continuities that connected Pharaonic Egypt to its mysterious predecessors. The loss of such documentation would have profound implications for how later Egyptians understood their own history and how modern scholars attempt to reconstruct the past. Without access to comprehensive archives, both ancient and modern historians have been forced to work with incomplete information, creating narratives based on surviving fragments rather than complete records. As the sun sets over the Hawara site, casting long shadows across the scattered stones that mark where one of history's greatest buildings once stood, the silence becomes almost palpable. Somewhere beneath the sand and scattered rubble lie the last traces of what may have been humanity's most ambitious attempt to preserve its own memory in permanent form. In the end, the labyrinth's disappearance may represent the final chapter in Egypt's long process of editing and reconstructing its own past. In the silence where the labyrinth once stood lies the echo of voices that once spoke with complete knowledge of Egypt's origins, now reduced to whispers that can barely be heard across the centuries that separate us from the time when memory was complete and the past was still accessible in its full complexity and truth. Night falls differently in Egypt. Long after the tourists leave, the air over the desert cools and the last colors drain from the sandstone. In that quiet, the monuments seem less like relics of the past, and more like pieces of a map, fragments pointing towards something we can no longer see in full. The story we have been told begins herein, these stones. But standing before them, you feel the weight of something older pressing in from the edges, the precision of a cut block, the alignment of a temple with the rising sun, the myths carved into granite. They seem less like inventions of a young kingdom and more like the careful arrangement of inherited pieces. Egypt feels like a room whose walls have been rebuilt, the plaster smoothed over, the paint refreshed, but where the faint outline of earlier architecture still shows through. The Nile has a way of hiding what it keeps. Every year it lays down a thin layer of silt, covering what came before. In time, whole towns vanish beneath its gift of soil. Civilization can work the same way. Each new age buries the old even as it builds upon it. And in Egypt, the burial was careful. Enough was kept to make the new kingdom strong. Enough was lost to leave its deepest roots in shadow. We think of history as a line that moves forward, but here it feels like a circle, a cycle of remembering and forgetting, of building on the ruins of what came before. In the cool silence between the pylons of a temple, you can almost feel that cycle turning, and wonder how many times the same story has played out long before Egypt had a name. Perhaps that is Egypt's greatest achievement. Not that it stood at the dawn of civilization, but that it stood at all, carrying fragments of a much older world far enough into the future for us to still sense them now. The details may be gone, the names forgotten, but the shapes remain, carved into stone that refuses to disappear. Somewhere under the sand, under the silt, under the centuries of retelling, there may still be a door that leads further back to the beginning before the beginning. And if that door is ever opened, the Egypt we know may turn out to be only a chapter, not the first page. Until then, the memory lies here beneath the stone, waiting for someone to see it.